The Shangri-La Dialogue, Asia's premier defence summit, has officially opened. Ministers and top defence officials are in Singapore to discuss the most pressing issues in security and to share their responses on policy. Vietnamese President To Lam is set to deliver the keynote this hour, in which he will likely outline what moves Vietnam will make to ensure it maintains autonomy and stability amid larger uncertainty. It will be Mr. To Lam's first major international address on foreign policy since taking office in April. Mr. Lam has already met US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth on the sidelines. Mr. Hegseth himself speaking tomorrow at tomorrow's first plenary session with remarks that will make clear where the Trump administration stands on the Indo-Pacific.
We'll be sitting in a bunch of meetings today, talking to a lot of ministers of defense. Some of it's going to be great, some of it's going to be really boring. But it's important to build our alliances with our allies, what we're doing out here. But none of it matters. Literally, none of those meetings matter. And they're important, they're significant. I stand here on behalf of the President. None of it matters without what you do.
Well, CNA's senior correspondent Leong Wai-kit joins us live from the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, where, of course, the Shangri-La Dialogue is being held. Wai-kit, any leader speaking at this keynote, always worthy of notice, mention, and careful analysis. But Vietnam's president, at this time, at this moment, at this particular SLD, why does it matter?
Well, to answer this question, so allow me to take you back to recent history. Now, traditionally, for the Communist Party of Vietnam, the role of foreign affairs, foreign policy, is not always very important. But that changed recently. The pillar of foreign affairs was elevated, and since then we've also seen Mr. To Lam double-hatting, also taking on the role of president. Now, some analysts are saying that the thinking, or the partial thinking, behind Mr. To Lam coming to the Shangri-La Dialogue is partially to project assertiveness as well as to project the leadership. So Mr. To Lam is likely to want to present Vietnam as a rising middle power, and at the same time to also project his leadership, to assert that leadership, because he's double-hatting. And some analysts say that this can either be an opportunity or expose vulnerabilities. But Mr. To Lam is likely to use his role as president, which is mainly external facing, to use those engagements as well as possibilities to have cooperations, bring all these benefits back home to Vietnam, where he's also party chief and also in a position to roll out these benefits for the people of Vietnam. Remember, in about 20 years, Vietnam's aim is to become high-income status. Now, all in, back to this Shangri-La Dialogue, this is viewed as a win-win situation, with Vietnam media framing it as Vietnam being recognized on the world stage, and the Shangri-La Dialogue organizers themselves also describing this keynote speech as historic, because there's been no Vietnamese leaders who have been in a position of party chief as well as president.
All right. Your suggestion, Wai-kit, that it is win-win both for Vietnam and for organizers of the Shangri-La Dialogue. Now, the way this works is the invitation is issued by IISS as the organizer of the SLD, and then in this instance, Vietnam's president then agrees to this invitation. For the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, given everything that's happening in the world, their reasons for asking Mr. To Lam as opposed to any other leader.
Well, I've spoken to some analysts about why Vietnam as a choice. Now, one of them has said that if you look at, say, the ASEAN region, Vietnam has domestically the least distractions back home, and its views within ASEAN as a bloc mirrors with majority of ASEAN bloc leaders. So there's this sense of ASEAN centrality that is tied to Vietnam and also to Mr. To Lam. Now, there are various interests that Mr. To Lam is likely to project on this platform here, one of which is defense, defending from geopolitical risks. And to that point, Mr. To Lam will likely urge for multilateralism, to call for peace in the world, and also to defend for Vietnam security threats. And to that point, perhaps Mr. To Lam or his Vietnamese delegation may use a platform like this, a defense forum, to expand partnerships, given that traditionally Vietnam has been reliant on Russia for weapons, weapon parts, supplies, and of course the Russia-Ukraine situation has exposed vulnerabilities. The other key thing that's very close to Mr. To Lam's heart is economy, for his people in Vietnam. He's likely to open the doors of Vietnam to attract investments and also to see whether there are any cooperations such as your digital transformation, working together for AI transformation, so they can bring all these projects back home as economy drivers for the country.
And a final question, Waikit. You are our go-to person on all things ASEAN. Mr. To Lam, where is he on ASEAN? Do we see a leader who is even more likely to push for this ASEAN centrality, or is he likely to pull back and perhaps look for other avenues, such as, for example, BRICS?
Yeah, the signs are very clear that Vietnam is ready to be a more active player, not just in geopolitics, but also in ASEAN. His actions will tell us so. Recently, or in recent years, rather, Mr. To Lam had made a trip to the ASEAN Secretariat, making his signal very clear that Vietnam wants to be more involved. And also in recent years, Vietnam has started to organize what's called a 1.5-track sort of forum where Hanoi hosts not just your world leaders, but also think tankers to discuss issues. That's called the ASEAN Future Forum. So we're looking at all these signs, the build-up of Vietnam playing a more important role within ASEAN. Remember, Vietnam is also playing host to APEC next year, and in years to come, ASEAN Chair.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks, my colleague there, Leong Waikit, speaking to us live from the Shangri-La Hotel right here in Singapore. Of course, when Mr. To Lam starts speaking, we will cross to him. But for now, we're joined by Dr. Kang Vu. He's visiting scholar for the Political Science Department at Boston College. Dr. Vu, you just heard from my colleague Waikit there. To Lam, perhaps more than any other Vietnamese leader, for him, foreign policy is as important as domestic policy.
Hi, thanks for having me on air. So I definitely think that this is one of the biggest stage that the Vietnamese top leader To Lam has been trying to give a keynote address in. So I think that the key point that we need to focus on here is how To Lam is going to deliver his foreign policy vision to the region and to the world. So he is the very first leader that delivered the keynote address, the Shangri-La Dialogue, in the position as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam and the President of the state. So in addition to his really ambitious domestic restructuring when it comes to condensing Vietnam level of governance, he is also trying to showcase his vision for Vietnam's era of national rise. And in this situation, how Vietnam can contribute its vision to navigating and to maintaining regional stability in the situation that the world is becoming more fractured and US and China rivalry is becoming more intense day by day.
All right, I want some detail from you on that. We keep saying this is an increasingly fractured global environment. Vietnam has faced 3 Indochina wars. It has seen all manner of conflict. It is no stranger to war and suffering. Is it for Vietnam, for what reasons, more fractured and more difficult now than it might have been, say, in the 1980s, 1990s, 1970s?
I think that every situation is different. But from the Vietnamese perspective, then the opportunity for our General Secretary and President To Lam to present the Shangri-La Dialogue is a unique opportunity for Vietnam to showcase that it is a prime example of being a country that once stood outside of a regional ASEAN order and then now becoming a member and now becoming more proactive in contributing its vision to the regional order. So back in the 3 Indochina War from 1945 to 1991, the world was obviously fractured between the communist and the capitalist blocs. But back then, the challenges for Vietnam was fighting against France, the United States and China to maintain its territorial integrity and to maintain its independence and unification. But now the problem is completely different. It's no longer about fighting to protect territory. It's no longer about fighting for independence. It's no longer about fighting for reunification. It's about trying to maintain a regional stability and a stable order so that Vietnam can really maintain its economic growth trajectory. And as President To Lam said, that Vietnam wants to become a high-income country by 2045, which is the 100-year anniversary of the country's founding in 1945.
All right, we will be coming back to you, Dr. Vu, to tell us after this speech where you see this foreign policy vision from President To Lam, what in fact it delivers. For now, let's take a look and take a listen to what the President is saying.
Wong, Prime Minister of Singapore, the host country. Dr. Bastian Giegerich, Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the Government of Singapore and the IISS for the honor of addressing at the opening session of this very important forum. For more than 2 decades, the Shangri-La Dialogue has evolved into a premier platform for regional security exchange where nations share perspectives, listen carefully to one another, and seek responsible pathways towards peace, stability, and development. We meet at a time when the world is confronted with multiple risks and uncertainty, more connected, yet more vulnerable, more technologically sophisticated, yet more exposed to misuse, more deeply interdependent, yet increasingly susceptible to pressure and coercion. While all nations continue to speak of peace, stability, and cooperation, the strategic environment is marked by growing lack of trust, fragmentation, and unchecked competition. Therefore, what we need to forge in advance is a shared vision, essential, no matter how minimal it might be, to safeguard peace, trust, and development for humankind in the 21st century. At the same time, we must strengthen our capacity to prevent crisis early and from afar, as experience repeatedly reminds us that many major crises begin with misunderstandings left unresolved, signals wrongly interpreted, and preventive mechanisms not activated in time. It is in this spirit that I would like to share some reflections on the theme proactively shaping peace, stability, and development in a world undergoing profound changes. Ladies and gentlemen, change is a constant feature of international affairs. Whether it is allowed to escalate to conflict or transform into a catalyst for peace depends on the strategic choices by nations and the international community. Looking at today's world, I believe that the current instabilities reflect the convergence of 3 foundational crises unfolding simultaneously and reinforcing one another, namely a crisis of the international order, a crisis of development models, and a crisis of strategic trust. First, the crisis of the international order. The international order is never static. A just order can evolve to reflect the changing realities of the world. Yet, such adaptations must occur through rules, dialogues, mutual accommodation, and self-restraint, not through coercion, unilateral imposition, threats of force, or the creation of fait accompli. The crisis of the international order begins when rules are still invoked, yet the binding force erodes, when commitments are repeatedly affirmed, yet undermined in practice. When fundamental principles of international law are interpreted selectively, applied inconsistently, or subordinated to the logic where might makes right, and the strong prey upon the weak. In such an environment, states, particularly small and medium-sized countries, face mounting pressure to choose sides and are increasingly vulnerable to coercion in the economic, technological, financial, and security domains. At the same time, the very connective space such as the seas and oceans, cybersecurity, supply chains, digital infrastructure, and undersea cables risk becoming arenas of strategic contestation. Recent tensions along strategic maritime routes in the Middle East remind us that conflict at a single flashpoint can rapidly disrupt trade, energy supplies, logistics, and socio-economic life across the globe. Second, the crisis of development models. For decades, globalization, trade and investment flows, technology diffusion, and supply chain integration have created extraordinary development opportunities for many countries, including developing ones. Yet these very engines are now under unprecedented strain. Growth is slowing. Public debt and the cost of capital are rising. Climate change is threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of millions. Disruptive technologies create immense opportunities, but also new divides. Trade, finance, tariffs, energy, food, data, and technology increasingly risk becoming tools of pressure. For many nations, development is not secondary to security. Development is the very foundation of enduring security. When development pathways are disrupted, when opportunities for developing countries' advancement are narrowed, economic fragility can quickly evolve into social and political instability and even strategic uncertainty. Third, the crisis of strategic trust. This may be a silent, yet dangerous crisis, because it causes states to interpret one another's actions through the lens of mistrust and anxiety. When trust declines, defensive measures may even be perceived as provocation. A difference of interest may escalate to confrontation. A minor incident may trigger spirals of reaction in the absence of dialogue, communication, and restraint. Strategic trust does not require elimination of differences or denying competition. Its essence lies in managing differences within a rules-based framework, ensuring that competition remains bounded, responsible, and predictable. A durable regional order cannot be built upon perpetual fear and mutual distrust. Emerging technologies are making these challenges even more complex. Big data, artificial intelligence, cyberspace, quantum technologies, autonomous systems, and digital infrastructure are expanding development capabilities, yet they also have the potential to amplify suspicion, enable information manipulation, compress decision-making timelines, and increase the risk of miscalculation. When technological advances outpace the evolution of rules and human oversight, strategic stability becomes more fragile. Therefore, overcoming this crisis requires a strategic framework for trust building, one that includes rapid communication channels in times of incident. It also demands transparency, dialogue, substantive information sharing to reduce misperception, clear codes of conduct to prevent collision, and sufficiently robust technological norms to ensure human beings remain ultimately responsible for decisions carrying grave security consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, these three crises are converging most visibly in the Asia-Pacific. This is the world's most dynamic center of growth, but also a theater of intense strategic competition, a region defined by vital maritime routes, yet fraught with risk at sea, a region that benefited profoundly from globalization, yet now faces mounting pressure from supply chain fragmentation, climate change, technological transition, and emerging geoeconomic competition. Precisely because it is where these challenges converge, the Asia-Pacific must also become where solutions emerge. This region shares a common interest in peace, connectivity, and development, and possesses deep experience in multi-layered cooperation. It is where the ASEAN functions as a framework for cooperation, dialogue, and balance, and it does have the motivation and resolve to ensure that competition does not slide into confrontation, that lines of connectivity do not become lines of division, and that one nation's security does not become another's insecurity. It is from this perspective that I would like to offer several recommendations for jointly shaping an Asia-Pacific that is peaceful, stable, resilient, and capable of mitigating risk early and from afar. First, we must make rules and dialogues truly effective instruments of risk reduction. The Shangri-La Dialogue should remain a platform where nations listen carefully to one another, clarify intentions, seek common grounds, and manage differences, not merely one for restating position. Dialogue must help identify risk early, facilitate information sharing, preserve communication channels during moments of tension, and prevent disagreements from escalating into crisis. Likewise, a rules-based order does not belong to any single grouping of countries. It is a common foundation upon which large, medium, and small states alike can coexist peacefully, grounded in international law and the UN Charter, with full respect for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, to the non-use of threat of force, to the peaceful settlement of disputes, and to sovereign equality. Rules acquire real meaning only when they are implemented consistently and translated into operational mechanisms such as early warning mechanisms, emergency communication channels, incident management protocols, self-restraint, and verifiable actions. This is particularly important for the seas and oceans. The seas and oceans do not only stand for resources, but they are also the shared space of connection, the lifeline of global trade, energy, food, and supply chains. No country would benefit when these routes become theaters of coercion, confrontations, or displays of power. With regard to the East Sea, Vietnam's position remains clear, consistent, and principled. Vietnam supports the peaceful settlement of all disputes and disagreements on the basis of international law, particularly the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Vietnam respects the legitimate rights and interests of other states while remaining resolute and persistent in safeguarding its own independent sovereignty and legitimate sovereign and jurisdictional rights in accordance with international law. Second, we need to shape an open, inclusive regional architecture with the ASEAN at its center. As new mechanisms and initiatives continue to emerge, we need a regional architecture capable of connecting interests, reducing mistrust, and reinforcing existing arrangements. All initiatives that contribute to peace, stability, and development should be welcomed, provided that they are transparent, respect international law, complement one another, and do not weaken ASEAN centrality or turn Southeast Asia into an arena of bloc confrontation. ASEAN centrality is neither taken for granted nor self-sustaining. It can only be preserved through unity, strategic autonomy, and the capacity to shape a common agenda. Inclusiveness must be matched by effectiveness, dialogue must generate action, and consensus must enable timely regional responses to shared challenges. In this regard, Vietnam supports and stands ready to work closely with the Philippines as the ASEAN chair in 2026, together with all other member states, to strengthen peace and security, to expand corridors of prosperity, to advance connectivity, to inclusive and sustainable development, and keep the people of ASEAN firmly at the center of our common endeavor. Third, we must place human security and societal resilience at the core of sustainable security. Instability today does not arise solely from military conflict, but also from fractures in development itself. Therefore, defense preparedness is legitimate, but sustainable security cannot rest on military power alone. Still less can it be built through arms races or by increasing developmental insecurity for others. What we need instead is a development foundation capable of withstanding systemic shocks, one supported by an open and diversified supply chains, by seamless infrastructure connectivity and cooperation in finance, technology, and human capital. At the same time, we must advance practical collaboration in disaster relief, health security, war security, food security, energy security, cyber security, critical infrastructure protection, and search and rescue operation. When cooperation tangibly enhances safety, safeguards livelihood, and improves the people's quality of life, strategic trust is renewed and strengthened. Fourth, we must shape responsible norms for emerging technologies in the defense industry. AI, big data, quantum technologies, autonomous systems, space technologies, cybersecurity, and high-tech supply chains are reshaping international security. These technologies can significantly expand our capacities for development, risk foresight, and governance, yet they can also be misused to launch cyber attacks, manipulate information, automate conflicts, enable unlawful surveillance, or create new forms of coercion. In the defense and security domain, the critical question is not how powerful technologies can become, but the extent to which humanity can retain control over it. We must therefore deepen dialogue on AI in defense and security domain, ensure human beings' ultimate responsibility in decisions carrying grave consequences, develop clearer norms of responsible conduct in cyberspace, strengthen protection for undersea cables and critical data infrastructure, and promote greater transparency regarding technologies affecting strategic stability. The defense industry should serve legitimate self-defense and regional stability, not to fuel arms race. Fifth, we must strengthen societal foundation and resilience, protect information space, and elevate public awareness. In a world of deep digital interconnection, instability no longer stems from conflict, supply chain disruption, or cyber attacks. It may begin from the erosion of trust within societies themselves. Disinformation, information manipulation, extremist incitement, social polarization, and coordinated influence operations can weaken national cohesion, distort public understanding, deepen societal divisions, and accelerate the spread of crisis. Safeguarding peace in our era, therefore, also means safeguarding truth, strengthening social trust, enhancing capacity for strategic communication, educating digital citizens, promoting the accountability of technology platforms, and deepening international cooperation to counter false and malicious information. A society capable of discerning truth from falsehood, maintaining cohesion and amid turbulence and resisting manipulation by fear, hatred, or distortion provides one of the strongest foundations for sustainable security. Sixth, we must strengthen the capacity for preventive diplomacy, mediation, and conciliation in the region. Many crises erupt not simply because of conflicting interests, but because the parties concerned lack trusted channels for communication, lack space for de-escalation, and lack mechanisms capable of steering confrontation back towards dialogue. The Asia-Pacific must therefore create preventive diplomacy as a strategic capability, not merely as an improvised response after the crisis has already erupted. We need more diverse channels of consultation, more agile mediation mechanisms, incident contact mechanisms, quasi-formal exchange platforms, and broader confidence-building initiatives linking defense establishments, security agencies, maritime law enforcement bodies, scholars, businesses, and social organizations. The objective here is to create credible diplomatic off-ramps before parties become drawn into spirals of escalation that heighten the risk of conflict. To partners with significant influence both within and beyond the region, Vietnam wishes to convey a sincere message as follows. The Asia-Pacific is an open space, and all countries with legitimate interests can have a role to play in contributing to its peace, stability, and development. The region welcomes engagement that is transparent, responsible, respectful of international law, supportive of ASEAN centrality, and conducive to reducing tension. What the region seeks is neither the mere presence nor absence of any major power. What it seeks is responsible commitment. We recognize that competition is an enduring reality of international relations, but competition must be bounded by law, guided by transparency, and exercised with restraint. Ladies and gentlemen, the three crises confronting our world today are not inevitable realities that we are bound to accept. What matters is we confront them squarely without allowing them to obscure opportunities for action. The crisis of the international order show that international law and self-restraint must be reinforced. The crisis of developmental model points to the need to renew growth drivers in ways that are inclusive, sustainable, and people-centered. The crisis of strategic trust calls for dialogue, transparency, responsibility, and more substantive mechanisms for cooperation. These answers will not emerge on their own. They can only become reality if nations work together to uphold and shape rules, connect interests, strengthen trust, and build practical mechanisms that effectively reduce risks. In a world of undergoing profound change, the challenge lies not only in external instability, but also in our insufficient preparedness to manage risk. What is needed is a shift from passive response to proactive shaping, from merely reiterating principles to operationalizing mechanisms, and from managing crises after they erupt to mitigating risk before they escalate. Therefore, the choice facing the Asia-Pacific today is not competition, no competition, for competition is an inherent reality of international relations. The more important choice is between unchecked competition and responsible coexistence, between division and dialogue, between mistrust and coercion, and a rules-based order and trust. Vietnam believes that our region possesses both the mettle and the shared stakes to choose a path of peace, cooperation, and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, Vietnam understands the value of peace through its own history and the value of development through its own journey of doi moi and international integration. From that experience, we have come to recognize profoundly that our national interests are intertwined with the peace, stability, and prosperity of the region. Contributing to regional peace is also a way of safeguarding Vietnam's long-term interests. Expanding cooperation, reducing risk, and intertwining legitimate interests are likewise how Vietnam fulfills its responsibility to the international community. Peace, stability, and development are the common denominator of all nations and peoples, but they carry meaning only when translated into concrete actions. Restraint in the face of disagreement, dialogue when divergence deepen, cooperation when challenges transcend borders, and the building of practical mechanisms capable of reducing risk in real terms. Vietnam therefore stands ready to work with countries both within and beyond the region to reinforce rules, nurture trust, promote dialogue, enhance cooperation, mitigate risk, and together shape an Asia-Pacific that is safer, more resilient, and more prosperous. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Mr. President, thank you very much for sharing your assessment of that converging crisis of...
Vietnam's President To Lam delivering the keynote at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue right here in Singapore. He framed the issues in terms of three converging foundational crises, and he called these first, and these are most evident in the Asia-Pacific, the first crisis being a crisis in the international order, the second, a crisis in development models, and the last, a profound lack of strategic trust. Repeatedly, Mr. To Lam referred to the need not just for Vietnam, in the region globally, for rules-based, law-based, predictable order. And he said the Shangri-La Dialogue plays a very big part in creating that dialogue and improving trust. Well, more analysis on Mr. To Lam's speech in just a moment, but we're back. We'll take a break right now. We'll have more from the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in just a moment. To stay with us.
Catch the Northern Lights at their most dazzling with Chan Brothers Travel. It's a snowy winter adventure like no other, where legends and fairy tales become a tantalizing reality. And the magnificent Arctic scenery unfolds before your eyes in ways you've only imagined. Northern Lights are just better with Chan Brothers Travel.
A great night's sleep can make all the difference. It can be the difference between having dreams and making them come true. A great night's sleep, night after night after night. That is the difference. The difference is temper.
Lock in fluoride, unlock stronger smiles. Clinica, #1 toothpaste brand in Japan. With high fluoride retention, Clinica Pro Toothpaste promotes teeth remineralization, delivers multi-benefits for lasting cavity defense. Clinica Pro Toothpaste. Lock in your strong teeth with high fluoride retention.
Anybody home?
What? You're early.
Mr. Graduate!
Mom! I missed you so much.
You too, Mom.
Let me look at you.
Also, this uncle was laying on me like the whole flight.
Really?
Mom, let me help.
What's wrong with being nice? Let's eat. Before it gets cold.
I really miss this.
You don't make it like that anymore. Whoa!
Eli's home. I think she missed you. We all did.
Mom.
So you've decided to take the job in London? You know, every mom wants to keep her child close. Until she sees how far he's meant to go.
Thanks, Mom.
We just heard a moment ago Vietnam's president delivering the keynote at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. He outlined what he said is a world confronted with multiple risks and uncertainty, more connected yet more vulnerable. And he framed that uncertainty and risk by a convergence of three, what he called foundational crises: in the international order, in development models, and in the lack of strategic trust. Mr. To Lam referring again and again to the need for a rules-based, law-based order. Dr. Wu joins us right now. He's a visiting scholar for the Political Science Department at Boston College. Dr. Wu, What stood out for you in this speech? 19 minutes of speech.
So what I understood from President and General Secretary To Lam's speech is that this is Vietnam understanding of the regional order, and the speech is drawn upon Vietnam experience with navigating the geopolitical front line and how to devise a foreign policy to maintain economic development. So President To Lam's speech is built upon Vietnam 4-No principle, which is no alliance, no siding with one country against the other, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, or using the territory of one member against the other member of the international community. And finally, no use of force or threat of use of force in international relations. So President To Lam said explicitly in his speech that the region should not be dominated by any powers, and that ASEAN members and the member of the international community should adhere to the rules of law and to make sure that there should not be any kind of arms race so that the region can be free of a great power rivalry and so that the region can maintain its economic growth and political stability.
These 4 no's that Vietnam has, in fact, is the backbone of its foreign policy from the 1990s onwards. I think the final edition was in the 2010s. Are there suggestions that now, and I'll ask you why, the world order as we know it is no longer quite so easily managed by this framework of Vietnam's 4 no's?
So Vietnam understanding of its 4 no's is that this is Vietnam's way to hedge among the great powers. So Vietnam devised its 4-No foreign policy at a time when it was allied with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was on the decline. So Vietnam at that time was internationally isolated by the United States and China, as well as by ASEAN and the United Nations. So the idea for Vietnam when coming up with the 4 no's here is that Vietnam should not be allied with any other great power, so that Vietnam will no longer be a great power battlefield like it was during the 3 Indochina Wars.
If I could just...
I think that what President To Lam...
No, pardon me. So Vietnam has done this proficiently for years, decades, in fact, balancing between two, at least two in one instance, and then a changing of superpowers to superpowers. But why is it now that hedging is proving even more difficult?
So I think that the idea behind Vietnam's strategy for hedging here is that as the great powers rivalry become more intense, it is more important for Vietnam and the member of ASEAN and as well as other middle powers to stay neutral. Because the moment that one member become allied with a great power, then the region can be polarized. And as Vietnam understood from its lesson from the 3rd Indochina War here is that it wants to be neutral in the Sino-Soviet conflict. But the moment that the Chinese or the Soviet Union demanded Vietnam to be on their side, which Vietnam later became a Soviet ally, then the region was deeply, deeply polarized, as we saw from the 3rd Indochina War when Vietnam fought against China and the Khmer Rouge, and the rest of ASEAN stood up against Vietnam. And Vietnam did not want that to happen. And it think that it's a lesson that members of ASEAN right now should understand, because that is a lesson that Vietnam take away from the Thailand-Cambodia conflict, is that the moment that one country no longer adhere to ASEAN centrality, seeking help from a great power from outside of the region, then other countries in ASEAN may decide that it's best for their own security to ally with another great power to oppose the other country effort to balance against that alliance. So I think this is an arms race, not only about guns and weapons, it's also about an arms race in diplomacy, is that the moment that one country decided to side with either the United States or China, then other countries may follow suit, and the region will become fractured and polarized. And this is what President To Lam is suggesting, that we should not be going down the path of.
But Dr. Vu, in principle, that should be the case. But we look at this particular Thailand, Cambodia, that fracas between the two. So one side was very prepared to be bilateral. The other one was consistently calling for an internationalization of the crisis, looking to the US, looking to China. The other side saying, we need to sort it out just between the two of us. So Vietnam saying, ASEAN centrality, we all need to stay neutral. Or neither Thailand nor Cambodia was listening at that point? What's the guarantee that anyone would ever listen to that in the future?
I think that this again boils down to Vietnam's proactive diplomacy role. So before President To Lam went to Singapore, he actually is on a tour to Thailand, to Singapore, and to the Philippines. And Vietnam also had a really close relationship with Cambodia. So Vietnam 4.0's vision is not just talk. So Vietnam is actively trying to maintain its relation and manage relation between its ASEAN peers. So when it comes to the Thailand-Cambodia conflict, Vietnam is saying that it doesn't support either side explicitly, but what it supports here is that it supports a peaceful end to the conflict. So with Cambodia, Vietnam consistently tells the Cambodian government not to use force and to adhere to ASEAN centrality. And when it comes to Thailand, President To Lam just went to Thailand, and in that visit, then President To Lam explicitly told the Thai government that Vietnam also want Thailand to adhere to ASEAN centrality, and Vietnam doesn't support any kind of conflict between ASEAN's members. And throughout the entire region as a whole, then President To Lam is trying to show that Vietnam is ready to become a mediator and also trying to make sure that its peers members' interests are honored. This is also, again, a lesson that Vietnam learned from hosting the 2019 Trump-Kim summit in Hanoi, which is a case that Vietnam is showing it can become a mediator to any kind of conflict in the region. So President To Lam is backing up his 4.0's, his vision for Southeast Asia with Vietnam proactive diplomacy.
All right, Dr. Fu, To Lam, for me, some standout points referring to small countries increasingly vulnerable to coercion in the economic, technological, financial, and security domains. Small countries, states, particularly small and medium-sized ones, are facing mounting pressure to have to choose sides. Vietnam, that could be one reason why it is the president's delivering the keynote at this Shangri-La Dialogue, because it's small to medium. It is a potential powerhouse, certainly in Southeast Asia. Is the solution in sorry, please continue.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that the President To Lam's presence at Shangri-La Dialogue this year sent a really strong message that as the war is becoming more fractured, then middle power has a role to play. So right now, when we look at countries like Vietnam, Vietnam was, again, outside of the ASEAN order, and now it's becoming a champion of that order. So what Vietnam is trying to suggest to the big powers, Russia, China, the United States, is that the middle powers also have a voice and have a role to play. So for Vietnam, obviously, it cannot arms race. It cannot fight against the great powers on its own. It's also a victim of great power rivalry. But what President To Lam is saying at Shangri-La and with his Southeast Asia tour is that middle powers, if they adhere to the same ASEAN centrality order and to international law, then these middle powers, they can actually secure and maintain regional order so long as they are not being coerced, they are not being polarized by any great power interference. That is a message that President To Lam wanted to send, because Vietnam lesson from the third Indochina War and the previous two Indochina Wars is that the moment that it is to side with a great power, then war was almost inevitable. So what President To Lam is trying to say here is that so long as the middle powers are neutral, not aligned, and they can maintain some degree of independence from the great powers, then the region can become peaceful and stable.
A final question, Dr. Fu. A lot is made of President To Lam being possibly the most powerful, at least in terms of the titles he holds, a leader in Vietnam in decades. He will be able to stay in office. He has been able to push through his many initiatives fairly coherently and consistently in the last 1-2 years, certainly. Vietnam would be one example of a country that is able to make economic security translate into defense security, which was a point that he was making. Defense alone is not what a country needs for sustained security. Final question on that.
Yeah, so I think that President To Lam is suggesting here is that the world order has changed. It's no longer just about guns and weapons. It's now about economic interconnectedness. So one thing I really find remarkable about President To Lam's speech is that he said economic security is also national security. And like you say, then if a country can become economically secure, and if the region can be free from an arms race, then ASEAN and the international order as a whole can be preserved. So what I think that President To Lam wants to send a message here is that Vietnam can be a model that other ASEAN members or other middle powers can emulate. First, you need to be economically stable so that you can maintain your internal order. So Vietnam has been really good at maintaining an impressive domestic economic growth rate. And Vietnam has been in the middle of a really huge infrastructure redevelopment at this point. So President To Lam has been really ambitious about turning Vietnam into a high-tech, a manufacturer of the world. And Vietnam is really trying to become one of the leaders in AI revolution. And translating that kind of economic development power into foreign policy, what President To Lam is trying to say here is that so long as Vietnam can maintain a stable economic order and stable political order, then it can leverage its position to win trade deals, to leverage its relationship with one big power to negotiate with another power. So that's why Vietnam, even though it was slapped a really high rate of tariffs by the United States, but its export to the US is growing, and its relationship with China are still really amicable. So what President To Lam is trying to say here is that countries in the region like Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they can also be adopting Vietnamese model of balancing economic growth internally with a foreign policy of non-alignment externally. The final goal here is that not just Vietnam is getting rich, but Southeast Asia as a whole can get rich. And if the region can get rich, then the possibility of war will decline, and the region as a whole can at least maintain an ASEAN centrality order and avoid being fractured by the use of force by any great powers. So President To Lam didn't mention any power specifically, but he just wanted to say that ASEAN as a whole should be free from coercion and domination by any single powers.
Thanks, Dr. Kang Wu, visiting scholar for the Political Science Department at Boston College.